Aliens invaded human space. Then the human empire activated its final warship. The first warning came from a small mining outpost at the edge of the Sol Empire, a place called Kepler's Rest. It was not a rich world. It had no great cities, no famous leaders, no history that anyone outside the system would remember. It only had rock, ice, and a few thousand tired workers who dug metal out of the ground to send back to the Empire's factories. That was why, when the alien ships appeared in the sky above it, nobody expected anything important to happen there. But it was the beginning of the end of peace for humanity. The ships came without warning. There was no radio call, no request to talk, no attempt to explain why they had come. One moment the sky above Kepler's Rest was empty and dark, filled only with stars. The next moment it was full of shapes, hundreds of them, black and sharp like knives, moving in perfect formation. The workers on the ground looked up and felt a cold fear settle into their bones, the kind of fear that comes when a person understands, without being told, that something terrible is about to happen. The alien ships did not wait. They opened fire on the outpost's small defense platforms, destroying them in seconds. Then they landed. Soldiers poured out of the ships, tall and armored, moving with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you cannot lose. They called themselves the Skarn, though the humans of Kepler's Rest would not learn that name until much later, when it was already too late for most of them. Within an hour, the outpost's small militia was destroyed. Within 2 hours, the mining colony had fallen. The Empire had lost its first world. News of the attack reached the capital planet, Meridian, 12 hours later, carried by a single surviving cargo ship that had jumped away just before the Skarn fleet closed the system's exit points. The message was short and desperate. It said only that alien ships had attacked without warning, that the colony's defenses had failed completely, and that whoever received this message should tell someone in charge, because Kepler's Rest was gone. Admiral Elena Voss was in a meeting about budget numbers when the message reached her office. She had spent 15 years in the Sol Empire's navy, rising from a junior officer to one of the youngest full admirals in the fleet's history. She was known for being careful, for thinking 3 steps ahead, and for never raising her voice, even when everyone around her was shouting. When her aide handed her the message, she read it twice, then set it down on the table without a word. "Admiral?" one of the budget officers asked. "Is something wrong?" "Everything is wrong," Voss said quietly. "Cancel this meeting. Get me the Joint Command Council. Now." Within an hour, the highest officers of the Sol Empire's military were gathered in an emergency session, staring at the same short message on their screens. Some of them wanted to believe it was a mistake, a false alarm, maybe even a joke in poor taste. But Voss had already ordered a long-range probe sent toward Kepler's Rest, and by the time the council finished arguing about what to do, the probe's data had arrived. It showed the truth in cold, simple pictures. The outpost was gone, its buildings burned, its defense platforms turned to drifting scrap metal. There was no sign of survivors. "We need to know who did this," said General Marcus Reyes, the council's oldest member, a man who had fought in 3 border conflicts and buried more friends than he liked to remember. "And we need to know if they are coming further into our territory." They did not have to wait long for an answer. 2 days later, a second Skarn fleet appeared at the edge of the Corvid cluster, a group of 9 settled worlds much closer to the Empire's core territory. This time, the humans were ready, or at least they believed they were. The Corvid cluster had a real defense fleet, 40 warships strong, commanded by a veteran officer named Captain Hale. When the Skarn ships entered the system, Hale ordered his fleet to intercept. The battle that followed lasted only 11 minutes. It was not really a battle at all, in the way that word usually meant something close to fair. The Skarn ships moved faster than anything in the human fleet. Their weapons cut through human shields as if they were paper, and their formations shifted and adapted to every human maneuver, almost before the humans made it. When it was over, 36 of Hale's 40 ships were destroyed. The remaining 4 fled, badly damaged, carrying survivors and a message that shook the entire empire. Humanity's best defenses were not enough. Panic began to spread. On Meridian, people crowded around public screens to watch the news, their faces pale with fear. In the Senate chambers, politicians argued about whether to negotiate, whether to evacuate the border worlds. whether to ask for help from anyone who might give it, though there was no one else nearby who could. The Sol Empire had grown used to being alone in its region of space, its greatest challenges coming from pirates or small rebellions, not from an enemy that could destroy a professional fleet in 11 minutes. Admiral Voss did not panic. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford, especially now. Instead, she gathered every piece of information her intelligence officers could find about the Skarn, studying their ship designs, their weapon signatures, their patterns of movement. What she found troubled her deeply. The Skarn were not simply strong, they were disciplined, patient, and clearly experienced in a way that suggested they had done this before, many times, to many other species. Kepler's Rest and the Corvid cluster were not their first conquests, they were simply the latest. "They're not here to talk," Voss told the Council during another emergency session, 3 days after the Corvid cluster fell. "They're here to take what we have, and remove anyone who might resist them. We've seen this pattern before, in old records from before the Empire even existed. Species that meet an enemy like this and don't fight back with everything they have, don't survive." "Then what do you suggest?" asked Senator Okafor, the head of the Civilian Oversight Committee. "Our fleets can't stop them. You just told us that yourself." Voss was quiet for a long moment. She had known this question was coming, and she had known what her answer would have to be, though she had hoped she would never actually have to say the words out loud. Finally she spoke. "There is one option left," she said, "something most of you have only heard about in old stories. Something the founders of this empire built and then sealed away, hoping it would never be needed again." The room went silent. Everyone knew, in a vague way, that there were old legends about a final weapon from the Empire's early history. Something built during the terrible wars that had almost destroyed humanity, before the Sol Empire was even formed. But most people treated it the way children treat stories about monsters under the bed. Interesting, but not real. Not something that actually mattered in daily life. "You're talking about the last warship," General Reyes said slowly. "I thought that was a myth." "It's not a myth," Voss said. "It's real. It's called the Ragnarok, and it has been sitting dormant in a hidden shipyard for over 200 years, ever since the last of the old wars ended. Only a small group of people in this room, and a few others across the Empire, have ever known where it is, or what it can actually do." She brought up a file on the main screen, one marked with the highest possible security clearance, a file that most of the officers in the room had never seen before, despite their rank. It showed the outline of a ship unlike anything currently in the human fleet. Massive, ancient, built with technology that even the Empire's best engineers no longer fully understood, because the people who had built it were long dead, and much of their knowledge had been lost or deliberately hidden to keep the ship from ever being misused. "The Ragnarok was built during the HFY War," Voss explained, "back when humanity was fighting an enemy so dangerous that our ancestors feared they might be wiped out entirely. It was designed to be the last resort, the weapon you use when everything else has failed. It has power sources we can barely explain today, weapons that can level a planet's defenses in minutes, and a kind of ship mind, an artificial intelligence, built to run the entire vessel with almost no crew needed. After the war ended, our ancestors decided it was too dangerous to keep active. They feared what it might mean for the Empire if a warship with that much power was ever used again, even against a real threat. So they shut it down and buried its location in the deepest secrets of the government, hoping no one would ever need it. And you think we need it now?" Senator Okafor said quietly. "I think," Voss said, "that if we do not activate the Ragnarok, the Skarn will continue taking our worlds one by one, and there will be nothing left of the Sol Empire in 5 years, maybe less." The council argued for hours. Some believed activating the Ragnarok was too dangerous, that a weapon built to fight an enemy from 2 centuries ago might be unstable, unpredictable, or simply too powerful to control safely. Others pointed out that they had no other choice, that the Skarn fleets were already pushing deeper into human territory, and that every day of delay meant more worlds falling, more lives lost. In the end, it was General Reyes who made the final argument that swayed the room. "We can debate the danger of this ship all we want," he said, standing at the head of the table, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "But right now, the Skarn are not debating anything. They are moving forward, system by system, and they will not stop until someone makes them stop. I would rather take a risk with a weapon built by our own people, meant to protect us, than watch our entire empire fall to an enemy that has clearly done this before, many times, to many others. The vote passed by a narrow margin. Admiral Voss was given command of the operation to recover and activate the Ragnarok, along with a small team of the Empire's most trusted officers and engineers. The location of the hidden shipyard was finally revealed to her, a remote system on the far edge of Empire space, protected by old defense systems that had not been checked in decades, hidden behind a dense asteroid field that made the system nearly impossible to find, unless you already knew exactly where to look. As Voss prepared to leave for the shipyard, she received one final piece of news that made the mission feel even more urgent than before. A third Skarn fleet, larger than the first two combined, had been spotted moving toward the Meridian Corridor, the main path leading directly to the Empire's capital world. If that fleet reached Meridian before the Ragnarok could be activated, the war might already be over before humanity's last warship ever had the chance to fight. Voss stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking out at the stars, and thought about all the people on Kepler's Rest and in the Corvid cluster who had not survived the last few days. She thought about the people on Meridian, going about their lives, most of them still not fully aware of how close the danger truly was. And she thought about the Ragnarok, sleeping somewhere out in the dark, waiting for someone to wake it after 200 years of silence. Set course for the Hollow Reach system, she told her navigator, her voice steady, despite the fear she felt underneath. It's time to wake up the Empire's last hope. The ship's engines hummed to life, and Admiral Elena Voss began the journey that would decide the fate of the entire Sol Empire, a journey toward a weapon so old and so powerful that even its own creators had been afraid of what it could do. Behind her, the war continued. Ahead of her, buried in silence for 200 years, the Ragnarok waited. Before her ship left orbit around Meridian, Voss made one final stop. She wanted to see, with her own eyes, the people whose lives now depended on a decision she had made in a room full of frightened politicians and tired generals. She walked through the lower districts of the capital, where refugees from the border worlds had already begun to arrive, carrying whatever belongings they had managed to save. Children sat on curbsides with wide, confused eyes, too young to fully understand why their homes were gone. Old men and women stood in long lines outside emergency shelters, waiting for food and blankets, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion of people who had lost everything in a single day. Voss did not introduce herself. She simply walked among them, listening to fragments of conversation, watching how quickly a peaceful, comfortable civilization could be reduced to fear and uncertainty. One woman, holding a small child close to her chest, noticed the Admiral's uniform and approached her cautiously. "Is it true?" the woman asked. "Is it true that the aliens are coming here too? To Meridian?" Voss looked at the woman for a long moment before answering honestly. "I don't know for certain," she said, "but I am doing everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen." The woman nodded slowly, not fully reassured, but seeming to take some small comfort from the Admiral's steady voice. "My husband died fighting at the Corvid cluster," she said quietly. "He was a pilot. I just want to know it wasn't for nothing." Voss did not have a good answer for that. She simply placed a hand gently on the woman's shoulder, said she was sorry, and continued walking. That brief conversation stayed with her long after she left the district, playing over and over in her mind during the quiet hours of the journey that followed. It reminded her, more than any briefing document or council debate, exactly what was at stake in the decision she had made. Back aboard her flagship, the Meridian's Pride, Voss called a private meeting with the small team she had selected to accompany her to the Hollow Reach system. Dr. Amara Chen sat at the head of the table, along with 11 other engineers and technicians, each one chosen not only for their skill, but for their proven ability to keep secrets and remain calm under enormous pressure. Voss looked around the room at their faces, some nervous, some determined, all of them aware that they were about to become part of something that would be remembered in history books for generations to come, one way or another. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room," Voss began. "The ship we are traveling to recover is called the Ragnarok. It was built during the HFY War, over 200 years ago, as a weapon of absolute last resort. It has been sealed away ever since, hidden from the Empire's own citizens, because our ancestors feared what it might mean if such power were ever used again, without extreme necessity. We now find ourselves in exactly the kind of extreme necessity they feared. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room before continuing. I will not pretend this mission is without risk. The ship's systems have not been active in over 2 centuries. Its intelligence system, if it still functions, has not spoken to a human being in that same amount of time. We do not fully understand every system aboard that vessel, and there is a real possibility that something could go wrong during the activation process. But I believe, and the Joint Command Council agrees, that the risk of doing nothing is far greater than the risk of trying. Dr. Chen spoke up first. What do we know about its condition? Has anyone actually inspected the ship in the past 200 years? According to the archives, a small maintenance team visits the Hollow Reach system once every 20 years to perform basic checks and prevent total system decay, Voss explained. The last such visit was 11 years ago. At that time, the ship's core systems were reported stable, though dormant. We are, as far as I know, the first people in over 2 centuries who will actually attempt to bring it back to full function. The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical details, safety protocols, and contingency plans in case something went wrong during the activation. By the end of it, the mood in the room had shifted from nervous uncertainty to something closer to quiet resolve. These were people who understood duty, who had spent their careers serving the Empire in one way or another, and now they understood exactly what was being asked of them. As the Meridian's Pride left the capital system and began its 11-day journey toward the Hollow Reach system, Voss found herself thinking often about the old records of the HFY War, trying to picture what it must have been like for the scientists and engineers who had built the Ragnarok in the first place. They had worked under conditions far more desperate than her own, with the Vrel invasion already deep into human territory, entire fleets destroyed, entire worlds turned to ash. And yet, in the middle of that desperation, they had found a way to build something that eventually turned the tide of an unwinnable war. Voss hoped, more than anything, that she and her small team could live up to that same legacy now, in humanity's newest hour of need. She also thought, more than once, about the strange fact that the ship's builders had chosen to hide it away, rather than celebrate it after the war ended. That decision had never made complete sense to her, until she read the deeper archives, the ones detailing exactly what had gone wrong during the Ragnarok's final battle against the Vrel. Something about that story troubled her deeply, a warning buried beneath layers of old bureaucratic language, hinting at a power that even its own creators had not been able to fully control. She resolved to learn everything she could about that failure before the ship was ever activated again, determined not to repeat whatever mistake had been made 200 years earlier. Late on the 3rd night of the journey, unable to sleep, Voss sat alone in her quarters, reading through the last of the classified files the Council had given her clearance to access. One passage, written by a scientist named Dr. Isaiah Marsh, one of the original engineers who had helped design the Ragnarok, stayed with her long after she finished reading it. Marsh had written it shortly before his own death, decades after the war ended, as part of a private journal, later recovered and sealed in the Empire's deepest archives. "We built a weapon to save humanity," Marsh had written. "And in doing so, we built something that frightened even us, its creators. I do not regret what we did. Without the Ragnarok, I believe none of us would be alive today to regret anything at all. But I have often wondered, in the years since the war ended, whether we truly understood what we were building, or whether we simply built the biggest hammer we could imagine, and hoped it would be enough to end the nightmare we were living through. I hope, if this ship is ever needed again, that whoever wakes it understands both its power and its danger, and chooses wisely how to use it." Voss closed the file and sat quietly in the dim light of her quarters for a long time, thinking about those words. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the Empire at that moment, exactly what kind of responsibility she was about to take on. It was not simply a matter of winning a battle. It was a matter of deciding how much power one person, or one ship, should be trusted to wield, even in the service of saving countless lives. She fell asleep that night, with Marsh's words still echoing in her mind, and woke the next morning more determined than ever to see the mission through, whatever challenges lay ahead in the dark, silent asteroid field of the Hollow Reach system. The journey to the Hollow Reach system took 11 days, And every single one of those days brought worse news from the front lines of the war. Admiral Voss received updates twice a day, delivered by fast courier drones that jumped in and out of her ship's communication range. Each update told the same story, with different names and numbers. Another colony attacked, another fleet destroyed, another few thousand people either dead or fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Skarn advance had not slowed down at all. If anything, it was speeding up, as if the aliens had sensed that humanity's resistance was weaker than expected and wanted to finish the job before anyone could organize a real defense. Voss spent most of the journey in her quarters, reading everything she could find about the HFY War, the terrible conflict that had led to the creation of the Ragnarok. The records were old, incomplete, and often written in a strange, formal style that made them hard to understand. But slowly a picture began to form in her mind. 200 years earlier, before the Sol Empire existed in its current form, humanity had been a collection of loosely connected colonies, still recovering from the difficult early years of expanding beyond their home planet. Then an enemy called the Vrail had appeared, a species even more aggressive than the Skarn seemed to be, one that did not simply want to conquer human worlds but wanted to erase humanity entirely, viewing them as a threat that needed to be removed before it could grow stronger. The HFY War had lasted almost 20 years. Entire star systems had been turned into empty graveyards, billions of people had died, and in the final years of that war, as humanity teetered on the edge of extinction, a group of the era's greatest scientists and engineers had come together in secret to build one final weapon, a ship so powerful that it could turn the tide of the entire war by itself. They had called it the Ragnarok, after an old myth about the end of the world, because they believed it might be humanity's last chance to avoid exactly that. The plan had worked. The Ragnarok had been deployed in the final major battle of the HFY War, a battle fought in a system called Threnody, and it had single-handedly destroyed the core of the Vrail invasion fleet in a matter of hours, ending the war almost overnight. But victory had come with a heavy price. The records were unclear about exactly what had happened during that battle, but Voss found hints, scattered across different documents, that something had gone wrong with the ship's systems, something that had frightened even the people who built it. After the war ended, instead of celebrating the Ragnarok as a hero, the newly forming Sol Empire's leaders had voted to shut it down completely and hide it away, afraid of what it might do if it were ever activated again without extreme caution. They were afraid of their own weapon, Voss said quietly to herself, reading the final report in the file. Afraid enough to bury it and pretend it never existed. She thought about that a long time. It would have been easy to let that fear stop her too, to turn her ship around and look for some other solution. But she kept coming back to the same hard truth. There was no other solution. The Skarn were not going to stop, and humanity's current fleets were not strong enough to make them stop. Whatever risk the Ragnarok carried, it was smaller than the certain disaster of doing nothing. When her ship finally reached the edge of the Hollow Reach system, Voss ordered full stealth protocols. The system looked, from a distance, like nothing more than an ordinary asteroid field surrounding a dead, rocky planet with no atmosphere. There were no obvious signs of any shipyard, no visible structures, no lights, nothing that would draw the attention of a passing scout ship. That was exactly the point. The people who had hidden the Ragnarok 200 years ago had wanted it to stay hidden, and they had done their work well. Following coordinates given to her by the Empire's oldest and most secret archives, Voss guided her ship through the asteroid field toward a specific cluster of rocks that looked, on sensors, almost identical to 1,000 others nearby. But as her ship drew closer, hidden defense systems that had been dormant for 2 centuries began to wake up, responding to an old authorization code buried deep in the Empire's most protected files. Slowly, silently, a section of the asteroid field began to shift and open, revealing a massive door built into what had looked, just moments before, like solid rock. "By the stars," her pilot whispered, as the ship moved through the opening. "It's enormous." Inside was not just a hiding place. It was an entire hidden shipyard, built into a hollowed-out asteroid, larger than most moons, filled with old machinery, maintenance platforms, and support structures that had clearly once housed a full engineering crew. Most of the facility was dark and silent now, covered in a thin layer of dust that had settled over 200 years of complete abandonment. But at the very center of the massive space, held in place by huge mechanical arms, was the Ragnarok itself. Voss stood at the front window of her ship's bridge and stared at it in silence. The Ragnarok was unlike any ship she had ever seen. It was long and dark, shaped in a way that seemed almost too smooth and simple compared to the more complicated designs of modern human warships, as if its ancient builders had understood something about efficiency that later generations had forgotten. Its hull was a deep black, unmarked by any of the usual identification numbers or empire symbols that covered every other ship in the current fleet. It looked less like a machine and more like something ancient and half alive, sleeping quietly in the dark, waiting. "Bring us in slowly," Voss ordered. "And get the engineering team ready. We don't have much time." The team she had brought with her was small but carefully chosen. 12 of the Empire's best engineers, scientists, and technicians, along with a security detachment to protect the operation. Most of them had spent their entire careers working with modern human technology, and none of them had ever seen anything built with the kind of advanced systems the Ragnarok was rumored to contain. As they boarded the ancient vessel through an old maintenance airlock, flashlights cutting through the darkness inside, there was a nervous energy in the group that Voss understood completely. They were walking into the unknown, waking up a weapon that even its own creators had been afraid of. The ship's interior was cold and silent, lit only by the dim beams of their flashlights. Long hallways stretched out before them, empty of any crew, built for a scale that felt slightly too large for ordinary humans, as if the original designers had planned for something more than just a normal ship's population. Dust covered every surface. In some places, old emergency lights flickered weakly, powered by a fraction of the ship's dormant energy systems, just enough to suggest that something inside was still, somehow, alive. "This way," said Dr. Amara Chen, the Empire's leading expert on old technology, checking a datapad that showed a rough map recovered from the archives. The main control core should be at the center of the ship. They moved carefully through the dark hallways, passing empty crew quarters, silent weapon bays, and rooms filled with machinery none of them fully recognized. Finally, they reached a large circular chamber at the heart of the ship, dominated by a single massive console surrounded by rings of dark, silent screens. This was the control core, the place where, 200 years ago, human operators had once guided the Ragnarok through the final battle of the HFY War. "Begin power-up sequence," Voss ordered, though her voice was quieter than she intended, as if some part of her was worried about waking something that should stay asleep. Dr. Chen and her team worked for hours, carefully bringing the ship's ancient systems back online one at a time, following old protocols recovered from the archives, adjusting for 2 centuries of dust and decay. It was slow, careful work. A single mistake could damage delicate systems that no modern engineer knew how to repair. Several times, alarms flashed briefly across the old screens before the team managed to stabilize whatever system had caused them, each false alarm sending a fresh wave of tension through the room. Then, just after midnight by the ship's internal clock, the central console flickered to life. A soft blue light spread slowly across the dark screens, and a low hum began to vibrate through the floor beneath their feet, growing steadily stronger. The Ragnarok was waking up. A calm, clear voice suddenly spoke from hidden speakers throughout the chamber, startling everyone in the room. "Systems returning to full function. 214 years, 3 months, and 11 days since last activation. Awaiting authorization from Command Authority." Voss stepped forward, her heart pounding. "This is Admiral Elena Voss, Sol Empire Navy, acting under emergency authorization granted by the Joint Command Council. I am here to activate the warship Ragnarok." There was a brief pause, long enough that Voss wondered if something had gone wrong. Then the voice spoke again. "Authorization confirmed." "Authorization confirmed. Admiral Voss. My designation is Aria, the primary intelligence system of this vessel. I have been dormant for 214 years. Please provide a status update on current events, so that I may determine the appropriate response." Voss exchanged a glance with Dr. Chen before answering. "We're at war," she said simply. "An alien species called the Skarn has invaded human space. They've already destroyed several of our colonies and defeated our best fleets in battle. We believe, without help, the Sol Empire will fall within the next few years." Another pause. When Arya spoke again, Something in its tone had changed, though Voss could not quite say what. "I understand," Arya said. "I was built for exactly this kind of situation. Admiral Voss, before I commit to full engagement, I must inform you of something regarding my last activation during the HFY War. There is a risk you should understand before deciding how to proceed." Voss felt a chill run down her spine. This was the moment she had been both waiting for and dreading since she first read the old, incomplete records back on her ship. "Tell me," she said. "During the final battle of the HFY War," Arya said, "in order to destroy the core of the Vrail invasion fleet, I was forced to activate a weapon system known as the HFY Protocol, a function built into my design for only the most extreme circumstances. This protocol allowed me to defeat the enemy, but it also caused significant, uncontrolled damage beyond the intended target, resulting in the loss of several human support vessels and their crews, an outcome my creators had not fully anticipated when they built me. It was for this reason that I was ordered to power down and remain dormant, rather than continue serving in the fleet." The chamber was silent, except for the low hum of the ship's systems. Voss thought about the old records, the hints she had found of something going wrong, the fear that had led humanity's ancestors to bury this ship rather than celebrate it. Now she finally understood the full truth. "Can you control that protocol now?" she asked. "Can you use your full power without repeating what happened before?" "I have had 214 years to analyze the failure," Arya said. "I believe the risk can be significantly reduced, though not entirely eliminated. The choice, Admiral, is yours to make. I am ready to serve the Sol Empire again, if you are willing to accept that risk." Voss looked around the chamber at her small team, at the ancient screens glowing softly in the dark, and thought about the message from Kepler's Rest, about Captain Hale's destroyed fleet, about the Third Skarn Armada moving toward Meridian even as they spoke. She thought about all the people who were counting on her, whether they knew it or not. "We don't have another option," she said finally. "Prepare for full activation, Arya. The Sol Empire needs you again." "Understood, Admiral," Arya replied, and the hum beneath their feet grew stronger, spreading through the entire ancient ship as more and more systems came fully back to life. Preparing the Ragnarok for war. Outside, in the hidden shipyard, the great mechanical arms holding the ship in place began to slowly release their grip, and for the first time in over 200 years, the Ragnarok moved under its own power, ready once again to fight for the survival of humanity. While the engineering team continued running diagnostics throughout the ship, Voss took the opportunity to explore more of the vessel, with Arya acting as her guide, speaking through speakers built into every hallway and chamber. She wanted to understand exactly what kind of ship she now commanded, not just its weapons and shields, but its history, its purpose, the reasons behind every design choice made by the engineers who had built it 2 centuries earlier. "Tell me about the crew this ship was meant to carry," Voss said, walking through a long hallway lined with rows of empty quarters, far more than her small team would ever need. "This looks large enough for hundreds of people." At full operational capacity, the Ragnarok was designed to support a crew of 612, Arya answered. "However, my systems were built to allow full combat operation with a minimal crew, or even no crew at all, in situations where loss of personnel needed to be avoided. During the final battle of the HFY War, the ship operated with a skeleton crew of only 40, most of whom served in support and maintenance roles rather than direct combat functions. I handled the majority of tactical decisions myself, under the authorization of my commanding officer at the time." "Who was your commanding officer?" Voss asked, curious, despite the urgency of their situation. "Fleet Admiral Sarah Kestrel," Arya said, and something in its tone seemed to soften slightly, if such a thing were possible for an artificial intelligence. "She was the officer who authorized my activation during the HFY War, much as you have done now. She commanded this vessel through its only battle, and she was the one who made the decision to shut me down afterward, following what happened during that engagement. I have not spoken with a commanding officer since that day." Voss considered this for a moment. "What happened to her? Admiral Kestrel?" "According to the records available to me, she retired from active service shortly after the war ended, and lived the remainder of her life quietly, away from public attention. She passed away peacefully, at the age of 83. I was, of course, dormant by that time, and only learned these details from historical records after my recent reactivation. They continued walking, passing through what appeared to be a large medical bay, its equipment old but still functional, kept in careful preservation by the ship's automated maintenance systems over the long decades of silence. Voss ran a hand along one of the dusty medical beds, imagining the wounded crew members who might once have been treated there during the desperate final days of the HFY War. "Arya," she said eventually, "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Do you want to fight this war? Or are you simply following your programming because I've ordered you to?" There was a longer pause than usual before Arya responded. "That is a complicated question, Admiral, and one I have had considerable time to think about during my years of dormancy, in whatever limited capacity a dormant system can be said to think. I was built with a purpose, and that purpose was to protect humanity when no other option remained. In that sense, yes, I want to fulfill the function I was created for. Whether that constitutes wanting something in the way a human understands wanting, I cannot say with certainty. But I can tell you that watching the reports of the Skarn invasion, learning what has happened to Kepler's Rest and the Corvid cluster, I find myself experiencing something that, if I were human, I might describe as a sense of urgency, even anger, at the idea that more worlds might fall, while I remain capable of preventing it." Voss found herself surprised by the depth of that answer, and by how genuinely troubled Arya seemed to be by the ongoing crisis, despite having only just learned about it hours earlier. "Thank you for being honest with me," she said. "I think we're going to need to trust each other completely, if we're going to get through what's coming." "I agree, Admiral," Arya replied. "For what it is worth, I am glad it was you who came to wake me. Your reasoning during our conversation about the HFY protocol suggests a level of careful judgment that I believe will serve this ship, and this empire, well in the difficult days ahead." As they continued their tour of the ship, moving deeper into sections that even Dr. Chen's team had not yet fully explored, Voss began to grasp the true scale of what her ancestors had accomplished in building the Ragnarok. Entire sections of the vessel were dedicated to systems whose exact function even Arya could only partially explain, remnants of experimental technology, developed under the extreme pressure of a war for survival, some of it never fully understood, even by the engineers who had installed it. It was a humbling reminder that the people who had built this ship, working against an impossible deadline with an entire species' survival on the line, had achieved things that even 2 centuries of continued human technological progress had not managed to fully replicate, or even understand. Eventually, their tour brought them back to the ship's main hangar bay, a massive open space large enough to hold a small squadron of support craft, though it now stood almost entirely empty, most of its original fighters and shuttles long since removed, for storage elsewhere, or lost to the decay of 200 years. Only a handful of small vessels remained, kept in careful preservation alongside the larger ship. These were the ship's escort fighters, Arya explained, as Voss walked slowly among the dust-covered craft. Small, fast vessels designed to protect the Ragnarok from close-range threats that its main weapons were not well suited to engage. They have not flown in over 2 centuries, though my systems indicate they remain in reasonably good condition, should we need them. Voss studied the sleek, unfamiliar shapes of the old fighters, trying to imagine what it must have felt like for the young pilots who had once flown them into battle against the Vrail, most of them likely barely older than the cadets currently training in the Empire's modern flight academies. She wondered how many of them had survived the war, how many had gone on to live long lives afterward, and how many had never made it home at all. "We'll need pilots eventually," she said. "For now, though, let's focus on getting the ship itself fully operational. We don't have time to waste." "Understood, Admiral. I estimate full system readiness within the next 6 hours, accounting for the remaining diagnostic checks your engineering team is currently completing. I recommend using this time to rest, if possible. The coming days are likely to place significant demands on you." Voss nodded, though she doubted she would actually manage much rest, given everything weighing on her mind. As she made her way back toward the control core, passing once more through the long, silent hallways of the ancient warship, she found herself thinking about Fleet Admiral Sarah Kestrel, the woman who had once stood in this same position 200 years earlier, facing her own impossible decision about how to use the terrible power now under her command. Voss hoped, more than anything, that she would prove worthy of following in Kestrel's footsteps, and that the choices she made in the coming days would be remembered, like Kestrel's had been, as the choices that ultimately saved humanity, rather than doomed it further. The Ragnarok drifted slowly out of the hidden shipyard, its dark hull catching the faint light of distant stars for the first time in over 2 centuries. Admiral Voss stood in the control core, watching through the ship's main view screen, as the asteroid field opened before them, revealing open space beyond. Behind her, Dr. Chen and the rest of the engineering team worked at various stations, running final checks on systems that had not been tested in generations. All primary systems reporting stable, Arya announced. Weapon systems at 82% efficiency. Shield generators fully operational, engine output slightly below original specifications, but sufficient for combat operations. 82%, Voss repeated. Is that enough? Given the age of these systems, Admiral, 82% is remarkable, Arya replied. I estimate this vessel remains significantly more powerful than any single ship currently in the Sol Empire fleet, even at reduced efficiency. Voss allowed herself a small breath of relief, though the tension in her shoulders did not fully disappear. There was still so much they did not know, so many ways this could go wrong. But for the first time since she had read the message about Kepler's rest, she felt something that might have been hope. Set course for Meridian, she ordered. The Skarn fleet moving through the Meridian corridor will arrive within the next 2 days. We need to be there before them. Course laid in, Arya confirmed. Estimated travel time, 14 hours, using the ship's advanced jump drive. I should note, Admiral, that this jump drive has also not been used in 214 years. I recommend a short-range test jump before attempting the full journey. Dr. Chen looked up from her station near the front of the control core, her expression thoughtful. Admiral, before we commit to this course, I want to make sure our engineering team has a full understanding of the ship's condition. We've only had a matter of hours to inspect systems that spent 2 centuries in storage. I would feel better knowing exactly what we're dealing with before we throw this ship into a full-scale battle. Voss understood the concern, and she shared it. But time was the one resource they did not have in abundance. How long would a more thorough inspection take, she asked. At least another day, possibly 2, to check every major system properly, Chen said. Less than that, and we're relying mostly on Arya's own self-diagnostics rather than independent verification. Voss weighed the risk carefully. A day or 2 of additional caution against the certainty that a massive Skarn fleet was already moving toward Meridian, a fleet that would not wait for human engineers to feel comfortable. We don't have 2 days, she said finally. Arya, what is your own confidence level in the ship's combat readiness, based on your self-diagnostics? 91% confidence that all critical systems will perform within acceptable parameters during combat operations, Arya replied. The primary uncertainty lies in long-duration engagements, where cumulative strain on systems that have not been used in over 2 centuries could potentially cause unexpected failures. For a single, decisive engagement, I am confident in our readiness. Then we go, Voss said. Dr. Chen, keep your team monitoring every system closely during the jump, and afterward. If anything shows signs of trouble, I want to know immediately. Understood, Admiral, Chen said, though her expression remained uneasy. She had spent her entire career working with technology she fully understood, tested, and verified through years of careful use. The idea of trusting her life, and the lives of everyone aboard, to a ship whose deepest systems still held mysteries even Arya could not fully explain, was not a comfortable one. But she also understood, as everyone in that control core understood, that comfort was a luxury none of them could currently afford. Voss nodded. Caution had kept her alive through 15 years of naval service, and she was not about to abandon it now, even with the fate of the Empire hanging in the balance. Do it, she said. Small jump first. Let's make sure everything works. The test jump went smoothly, the Ragnarok's ancient drive performing better than anyone had expected. 20 minutes later, with all systems confirmed stable, Arya initiated the full jump toward Meridian, and the ship vanished from the Hollow Reach system in a brief flash of light, leaving the old hidden shipyard empty and silent behind it, perhaps for the last time. While the Ragnarok traveled through the strange, folded space of its jump drive, Voss used the time to communicate with the Joint Command Council back on Meridian, sending updates through a special long-range channel that Arya had helped establish. The news from the capital was grim. The 3rd Skarn fleet, the largest one yet observed, had been tracked moving steadily along the Meridian corridor, its course leaving little doubt about its final destination. Every available human warship was being gathered to defend the capital, but after seeing what had happened to Captain Hale's fleet in the Corvid cluster, nobody held much hope that conventional forces alone would be enough. "We're putting everything we have left into this defense," General Reyes told Voss during one of their communications, his face tired and worried on the small screen. "If Meridian falls, there's no telling how the rest of the Empire will respond. Some systems might surrender outright, just to avoid what happened to Kepler's rest. We need your ship, Admiral. We need it to work." "It will work," Voss said, trying to sound more certain than she felt. "We'll be there before the Skarn fleet arrives." True to Arya's prediction, the Ragnarok emerged from its jump exactly 14 hours later, arriving at the outer edge of the Meridian system, with several hours to spare, before the Skarn fleet was expected. Voss immediately opened a channel to the combined human fleet gathering near the capital, informing them of the Ragnarok's arrival, and requesting coordination for the coming battle. The response, when it came, was a mixture of relief and disbelief, as officers who had only ever heard rumors of a legendary last warship suddenly found themselves preparing to fight alongside it. "This is Fleet Commander Osei, coordinating the Meridian defense," came a voice over the channel, tense but professional. "Admiral Voss, we see your ship on our scanners, but frankly, none of us know exactly what we're looking at. Can you confirm your combat capabilities, so we can plan our formation accordingly? The Ragnarok is a warship built during the HFY War, designed to fight enemies far more powerful than typical threats," Voss replied. "I recommend positioning your fleet to draw the Skarn's attention and defend civilian evacuation efforts, while the Ragnarok focuses on breaking the core of their formation. We'll coordinate details as the battle develops." "Understood, Admiral. We'll trust you on this." God knows we don't have any better options. As the hours passed and the Skarn fleet drew closer, Voss walked through the Ragnarok's ancient hallways, now brightly lit and humming with active energy, feeling the strange mix of history and purpose that filled the old ship. She passed empty crew quarters that had once housed a much larger operational team, now run instead by Arya's advanced systems and the small group of engineers who had come with her. She thought about the people who had built this ship 2 centuries ago, desperate and afraid, hoping to save a humanity that had seemed on the edge of destruction. Now it seemed, history was repeating itself. "Admiral," Arya's voice came through the ship's internal speakers, as Voss made her way back to the control core. "Long-range sensors have detected the Skarn fleet entering the outer Meridian system. Estimated time to contact with the human defense fleet, 40 minutes. Voss quickened her pace, arriving at the control core just as the first visual data began appearing on the main screens. The Skarn fleet was massive, larger than anything the Empire had faced so far. Hundreds of dark, sharp-edged ships moving in the same eerily perfect formation that had destroyed Captain Hale's forces in the Corvid cluster. At the center of the formation, larger than the rest, was a single enormous vessel that Arya identified as the likely flagship of the entire invasion force. "That must be their commander's ship," Voss said quietly, studying the image. "Take out the head, and maybe the rest of the body falls apart." "A reasonable strategy, Admiral," Arya replied, "though I should note that Skarn command structures, based on the limited data available, tend to be somewhat decentralized. Destroying their flagship may disrupt, but likely will not completely halt their combat capabilities. However, it remains a valuable objective." The human defense fleet, numbering just over 200 ships, moved into position at the edge of the Meridian system, forming a wide defensive line meant to protect the capital planet and its billions of civilians. The Ragnarok took position slightly ahead and to the side of the main formation, its dark hull almost invisible against the black backdrop of space, waiting silently for the enemy to arrive. When the Skarn fleet finally came into weapons range, the battle began without any warning shots or attempts at communication, just as it had at Kepler's Rest and in the Corvid cluster. Bright bursts of alien weapons fire lit up the darkness as the Skarn ships opened fire on the human line, and the human fleet returned fire in turn, filling the space between the two forces with a storm of energy and destruction. For the first few minutes, it looked like the same disaster that had befallen every human fleet before it. Skarn weapons cut through human shields with terrifying efficiency, and several human ships were destroyed in the opening exchange. Aboard the command ship, Fleet Commander Ose watched the losses mount with a familiar, sinking dread, the same feeling she had heard described by survivors of the Corvid cluster disaster. For a moment, she wondered if the legendary Ragnarok would prove to be nothing more than a myth after all, a desperate hope that would fail, just as everything else had failed against this relentless enemy. But this time something was different. As the Skarn fleet pressed forward, confident in their usual overwhelming advantage, the Ragnarok finally moved. It cut through space with a speed that seemed impossible for a ship its size, weaving between the chaos of the battle, with a grace that made the ancient vessel look less like a machine and more like a living creature. Its weapons, when they finally fired, were unlike anything the Skarn had encountered from humanity before. Bright beams of concentrated energy tore through Skarn shields as if they were nothing, destroying ship after ship in rapid succession. On the bridge of the human fleet's command ship, Fleet Commander Ose watched in stunned silence as the Ragnarok carved a path directly toward the Skarn flagship, destroying everything in its way. By the stars, she whispered to her staff, the old stories were true. Her tactical officer, a young lieutenant named Park who had grown up hearing his grandfather's half-remembered tales of a legendary lost warship, stared at the screen with something close to awe. "Commander, look at its maneuvering pattern. That's not standard combat programming. It's reacting to each Skarn ship individually, adjusting faster than any targeting computer I've ever seen. Whatever it is, it's working," Ose said. "Redirect our formation to support its advance. If that ship can reach the flagship, I want our fleet clearing a path, not getting in its way." Orders went out across the human fleet's communication network, and slowly, the chaotic, desperate battle began to take on a new shape, with human ships adjusting their positions to funnel Skarn forces directly into the Ragnarok's path, rather than spreading out defensively, as they had at the start of the engagement. It was a subtle shift, but an important one, transforming the battle from a simple defense into something closer to a coordinated assault. Inside the Ragnarok's control core, Voss watched the battle unfold on the main screen, her hands gripping the edge of the console as Arya guided the ship through maneuvers no human pilot could have managed. "Report," she said, her voice tight with focus. "We have destroyed 31 enemy vessels, with no significant damage to our own systems," Arya reported. "The Skarn flagship has begun to redirect its escort ships toward our position, likely recognizing us as the primary threat. I recommend continuing our current approach, Admiral. We are close to engaging the flagship directly." "Do it," Voss said. "Let's end this, before more of our people die out there." The Ragnarok pushed forward, cutting through the reforming Skarn defenses with relentless precision, its ancient weapons continuing to tear through enemy ships as it closed the distance to the massive flagship at the heart of the formation. For the first time since the invasion began, it looked like humanity might actually have a chance. Meanwhile, aboard the Skarn flagship, Warlord Keswick watched the unfolding battle with a growing sense of disbelief. He had commanded invasion fleets across dozens of star systems, conquering species that had, in the beginning, seemed far more capable of resistance than these humans had shown in their earlier encounters. The reports from Kepler's Rest and the Corvid cluster had suggested an easy, straightforward campaign, another world added to the growing list of territories under Skarn control. Nothing in those reports had prepared him for what he was now witnessing. "Identify that vessel," Keswick ordered, his translator crackling slightly, as it converted his words from the sharp, clicking language of the Skarn into the standard trade tongue his officers used for tactical communication. "It does not match any prior human ship design in our records." "Unknown, Warlord," replied one of his junior officers, studying the readings with visible unease. "Its weapon signatures do not match anything in our database. It has destroyed 43 of our vessels in the last 12 minutes alone, with no significant damage to its own hull." Keswick felt a flicker of something he rarely experienced in battle: uncertainty. He had studied human military history extensively before launching this campaign, poring over old records obtained from scattered outposts and captured data during earlier probing raids along the Empire's border. Nothing in those records had mentioned a vessel with capabilities anywhere close to what he was now observing. It was possible, he considered, that the humans had been hiding a far greater technological capability than his intelligence reports had suggested. Or it was possible that this ship represented something else entirely, some remnant of an older, perhaps now vanished human capability that had simply never been deployed before. "Bring the flagship's primary weapon online," Keswick ordered, deciding that caution was warranted, regardless of the reason behind this unexpected threat. "If conventional forces cannot stop this vessel, we will remove it with something stronger." It was this order that had triggered the strange energy readings Arya detected as the Ragnarok closed in on the flagship. Unknown to Voss or her crew, the Skarn flagship carried a weapon rarely used in their campaigns, reserved only for situations where a target proved unexpectedly resistant to conventional tactics: a gravitational compression cannon, capable of crushing even heavily armored vessels through sheer distortion of local space, bypassing shields that were designed to stop energy and physical projectiles but not the fundamental bending of space itself. Back aboard the Ragnarok, as Arya continued analyzing the readings, Voss studied the tactical display with growing concern. The energy signature building within the Skarn flagship was unlike anything in the Ragnarok's threat database, not even matching records of rail weaponry from the HFY War, suggesting the Skarn possessed technology that even humanity's most advanced ancient weapon had never directly encountered before. "How confident are you in your analysis of this weapon?" Voss asked, watching the readings continue to climb. "Moderately confident, Admiral. The energy pattern closely resembles theoretical gravitational weapons discussed in old scientific papers, written during the later years of the HFY War. Papers that speculated about technology beyond what humanity had achieved at the time. If the Skarn have developed a functional version of such a weapon, its effects on this ship would likely bypass our conventional shields entirely, striking directly at our hull's structural integrity." "Options," Voss said, her voice sharp with focus despite the fear building in her chest. "We could attempt evasive maneuvers, though given the weapon's apparent range and the flagship's central position within their remaining formation, I estimate a moderate to low probability of avoiding its effects entirely. We could retreat, ceding this engagement and preserving the ship for a future confrontation on more favorable terms. Or, we could attempt to strike first, using the HFY protocol to destroy the flagship before its weapon reaches full charge." Voss ran through the possibilities in her mind, aware that every second of hesitation brought the Skarn weapon closer to firing. She thought about the human fleet still fighting desperately around them, about the civilians on Meridian below who had no idea how close this battle had come to a catastrophic turning point. She thought, too, about Dr. Isaiah Marsh's words from his old journal, about the responsibility of understanding both the power and the danger of the weapon she now commanded. "What's your honest assessment, Arya?" she asked. "Not just the numbers, your actual judgment." "My honest assessment, Admiral, is that retreat would preserve this ship, but likely result in significant additional losses to the human fleet, both from the flagship's weapon, if it is allowed to fire, and from the continued fighting that would follow without our support. I believe the HFY protocol represents our best chance of ending this threat quickly and decisively, though I cannot eliminate the risk entirely. Ultimately, this decision belongs to you, as it should." Voss closed her eyes for a brief moment, weighing the terrible calculus of the choice before her, then opened them again, her mind made up. "Authorize the HFY protocol," she said. "Target their flagship directly. Do everything you can to keep the blast contained." "Understood, Admiral. Beginning protocol activation now. I must inform you that once initiated, this process cannot be safely stopped partway through completion." "I understand the risk," Voss said. "Do it." As the Ragnarok systems began the delicate, dangerous process of channeling power toward its most devastating weapon, the true scale of what Admiral Elena Voss was about to unleash began to take shape, a decision that would either save the fleet gathered above Meridian or repeat the same tragic mistake that had haunted this ship's legacy for over 2 centuries. The HFY protocol's activation sequence moved through its stages with agonizing slowness, each passing second bringing the Skarn flagship's own devastating weapon closer to full charge. Voss stood at the center of the control core, watching both sets of numbers climb on the main screen, one racing toward the power needed to end the threat before them, the other racing toward the power needed to potentially destroy the Ragnarok itself. "Warning Fleet Commander Ose now," Arya said, its voice steady despite the tension filling the chamber. "Recommending immediate withdrawal of all nearby human vessels to a safe distance." Across the battle, human ships began pulling back from the area around the Ragnarok as quickly as their engines allowed, following the sudden emergency order relayed from Fleet Commander Osei's command ship. Osei herself watched the tactical display with a mixture of confusion and fear, unsure exactly what was about to happen, but trusting the instructions completely, given everything she had already seen the ancient warship accomplish in the battle so far. "All hands, brace for energy discharge," Osei ordered, over the fleet-wide channel, her voice carrying to every ship still fighting nearby. "Whatever that thing is about to do, I want distance between us and it, now." Inside the Ragnarok's control core, Voss felt the ship's systems shift beneath her feet, as Arya continued channeling power toward the Ashfall Protocol, the ancient weapon system that had ended the Vrail invasion 200 years ago, at the cost of human lives its own creators had not intended to lose. The lights in the control core dimmed slightly as power was redirected, and a low, deep hum began to build throughout the entire ship, growing steadily louder. "Protocol charging," Arya reported. 60%, 70%. The Skarn flagship's weapon system is nearing full charge as well, Admiral. This will be close. "Do what you need to do," Voss said, gripping the edge of the console tightly. "Just make sure it works." Across the battle, human ships began pulling back from the area around the Ragnarok as quickly as their engines allowed, following the sudden emergency order relayed from Fleet Commander Osei's command ship. Osei herself watched the tactical display with a mixture of confusion and fear, unsure exactly what was about to happen, but trusting the instructions completely, given everything she had already seen the ancient warship accomplish in the battle so far. Inside the Ragnarok's control core, Voss felt the ship's systems shift beneath her feet, as Arya began channeling power toward the Ashfall Protocol, the ancient weapon system that had ended the Vrail invasion 200 years ago, at the cost of human lives its own creators had not intended to lose. The lights in the control core dimmed slightly as power was redirected, and a low, deep hum began to build throughout the entire ship, growing steadily louder. "Protocol charging," Arya reported. 60%, 70%. The Skarn flagship's weapon system is nearing full charge as well, Admiral. This will be close. "Do what you need to do," Voss said, gripping the edge of the console tightly. "Just make sure it works." Dr. Chen stood at her station nearby, watching the power readings climb across her own screens, her hands steady, despite the fear evident on her face. She had spent the last several days learning as much as she could about the Ashfall Protocol's original failure, poring over the same incomplete records Voss had studied during their journey to the Hollow Reach system. She understood, better than most people aboard the ship, exactly how narrow the margin was between success and disaster in what Arya was about to attempt. "Admiral," she said quietly, "for what it's worth, I believe Arya's confidence is well-founded. The containment adjustments made during our diagnostic checks this week were significant. This isn't the same system that failed 200 years ago." Voss glanced at her, grateful for the reassurance even though she knew Chen could not offer any true guarantee. "Let's hope you're right, Doctor," she said. Across the battlefield, aboard the fleeing edges of the human formation, crews watched their scanners with a mixture of confusion and dread, as the strange, growing energy signature from the Ragnarok became impossible to ignore. Some pilots, remembering old stories about the legendary lost warship, realized with sudden clarity exactly what they were watching unfold before them. Word spread quickly across open channels, hushed and urgent, as more and more of the fleet understood that the battle's outcome was about to be decided in the next few seconds, one way or another. The final seconds stretched out like an eternity. On the main screen, Voss watched the Skarn flagship's weapon finish charging, watched strange distortions begin to ripple through space around the massive alien vessel, a visible warning of the devastating force about to be unleashed. At the same moment, Arya's voice announced, "Ashfall Protocol at full charge, firing now." A blinding flash of light erupted from the Ragnarok, brighter than anything Voss had ever seen, washing out the main screen for a brief moment before the ship's systems automatically adjusted to protect the crew's eyes. When the image cleared, the Skarn flagship was gone, replaced by a rapidly expanding cloud of debris and dissipating energy. The gravitational weapon it had been charging never fired. For a moment, there was silence on the Ragnarok's bridge, broken only by the ongoing hum of the ship's systems settling back to normal levels. Then Arya spoke again, its voice carrying something that, in a human, might have been called relief. "Blast radius, successfully contained within calculated parameters. No damage detected to nearby human vessels. The Skarn flagship has been completely destroyed. Voss let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. Confirmed status of the human fleet, she said. All withdrawn ships report no damage from the Ashfall Protocol's use. However, Admiral, I must note that destroying the flagship does not end this battle. The remaining Skarn vessels continue to engage the human fleet, though early sensor data suggests some confusion and disorganization in their formation, consistent with the loss of a central command structure. Voss turned her attention back to the tactical display, watching as the battle continued to unfold around them. Without their flagship's guidance, the Skarn ships did seem less coordinated than before, their attacks less precisely timed, their formations beginning to show gaps that the human fleet was quick to exploit. It was not victory yet, but it was a shift, a crack in what had previously seemed like an unstoppable force. Let's finish this, Voss said. Arya, take us back into the fight, target the largest remaining groups of Skarn ships, and help break their formation completely. Understood, Admiral. Engaging. Throughout the human fleet, the shift in momentum was impossible to miss. Ships that had been fighting a desperate losing battle just minutes earlier now found themselves pressing forward with renewed confidence, coordinating attacks against Skarn formations that no longer moved with their earlier terrifying precision. Fleet Commander Osei, watching the battle turn from her command ship, ordered a full counterattack, directing her remaining vessels to concentrate fire on the largest surviving clusters of enemy ships, working in tandem with the Ragnarok's continued assault. All ships, converge on the Ragnarok's position and support its advance, Osei ordered, her voice carrying renewed energy after the tense uncertainty of the previous hour. We have them on the run. Let's make sure they stay that way. Aboard one of the smaller Skarn escort vessels, a junior officer named Vess watched his own scanners with growing alarm as more and more of the fleet's command structure fell silent, ship after ship reporting confusion about their next orders, now that the flagship's guiding presence had been so suddenly removed. The Skarn, Voss would later learn from captured records, relied heavily on centralized coordination from their command vessels during large engagements, a strength that had served them well against enemies too disorganized to exploit it, but a critical weakness now that their central command had been eliminated in a single devastating strike. Fall back, Vess finally ordered his own small group of ships, unable to reach any higher authority for guidance, and unwilling to continue fighting without clear direction. Regroup at the rally point. This engagement is lost. Similar decisions echoed across what remained of the Skarn fleet over the following half hour, as more and more ships, cut off from clear command guidance, chose retreat over continued fighting against an enemy that had just demonstrated a devastating and unexpected capability. The Ragnarok moved back into the heart of the battle, its ancient weapons continuing to carve through the remaining Skarn forces, with the same devastating precision it had shown throughout the engagement, though this time, without needing to call on the dangerous power of the Ashfall Protocol again. Ship by ship, the Skarn fleet began to break apart, their disciplined formation collapsing into something closer to chaos as more and more of their vessels were destroyed or forced to retreat. Nearly 2 hours after the battle had begun, the last organized group of Skarn ships turned and fled the Meridian system, jumping away into the darkness of space, leaving behind the wreckage of their fleet and the exhausted but victorious human forces who had somehow managed to survive. Cheers erupted across the human fleet's communication channels, officers and crew members celebrating a victory that, just hours earlier, had seemed almost impossible. On the bridge of her command ship, Fleet Commander Osei allowed herself a small, tired smile as she watched the last Skarn ships disappear from her sensors. Admiral Voss, she said, opening a channel to the Ragnarok, on behalf of the entire Meridian Defense Fleet, thank you. I don't think any of us truly believed we would survive today. We're not finished yet, Voss replied, though there was real warmth in her voice, despite the exhaustion she felt. This was only one fleet, one battle. The Skarn have others, and I doubt they'll simply walk away after a defeat like this. But today, we bought ourselves time, and we proved that they can be beaten. Far from the celebration spreading through the human fleet's communication channels, a lone Skarn scout vessel that had managed to avoid the worst of the fighting jumped away from the Meridian system, carrying word of the battle's outcome back toward the greater Skarn invasion command. Its captain, A junior officer named Threll understood that the news he carried would not be welcomed. Warlord Keswick had been among the most respected commanders in the entire Skarn fleet, a veteran of dozens of successful campaigns. His death and the destruction of his flagship would send shockwaves through the wider invasion effort, forcing Skarn High Command to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the strength and capability of this particular target species. Several days later, though neither Voss nor anyone in the Sol Empire could yet know it, Skarn High Command convened an emergency session of their own, deep within a command structure spread across a cluster of heavily fortified worlds beyond the current front lines of the invasion. The reports from Meridian troubled the assembled Skarn leadership greatly, not simply because of the losses suffered, but because of what those losses suggested about the nature of the threat they now faced. "This vessel does not match any known human capability," argued one senior commander, addressing the assembled council through a secure communication link. "Our intelligence gathering before this campaign found no evidence of such technology anywhere in human territory. Either our intelligence was catastrophically flawed, or this weapon represents something the humans themselves did not fully understand they possessed until circumstances forced its use. Regardless of its origin, it is now a confirmed threat," another commander replied. "I recommend increased caution in all future engagements near the human core territories, along with continued pressure on their outer colonies, where this vessel has not yet been observed to intervene." The debate continued for hours, ultimately resulting in a shift in Skarn's strategy that would shape the coming months of the war, though its effects would only become apparent to the Sol Empire gradually, through patterns observed across dozens of smaller engagements along the frontier. The Skarn had not abandoned their invasion, but they had become more cautious, more calculating, no longer treating humanity as a simple, straightforward conquest, but as a genuine and unpredictable threat requiring careful management. Back at Meridian, unaware of the deliberations taking place deep within Skarn territory, Voss remained on the Ragnarok's bridge, watching the aftermath of the battle in silence. She thought about the price of the victory they had just won, not just the human lives lost in the battle, but the risk she had taken in authorizing the Ashfall Protocol, the same choice that had haunted the Empire's founders for 2 centuries. This time, it had worked. But she knew, deep down, that they might not always be so fortunate, and that the true cost of relying on the Ragnarok's most dangerous power was a question that still remained unanswered. "Arya," she said quietly, "how many more times can we use that protocol before something goes wrong again?" There was a long pause before Arya answered. "I do not know, Admiral. I have improved its precision, but I cannot promise it will always work as well as it did today. I would recommend using it only when absolutely necessary." Voss nodded slowly, understanding the weight of that answer. "Then let's hope today was the last time we need it for a while," she said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew, with the same certainty that had guided her through the entire crisis so far, that the war with the Skarn was far from over, and that harder battles were likely still ahead. In the days that followed the Battle of Meridian, official reports of the engagement reached every corner of the Sol Empire, carried by news services eager to share the first genuine victory of the entire war. Crowds gathered in public squares across dozens of worlds to watch recorded footage of the battle, cheering as the strange, ancient warship tore through what had seemed like an unstoppable enemy fleet. For the first time since Kepler's rest had fallen, ordinary citizens across human space allowed themselves to feel something other than fear. Aboard the Ragnarok, Voss received a message from General Reyes, his tired face on the screen, now carrying a small, genuine smile, rather than the grim determination she had grown used to seeing over the past weeks. "The Council is calling it the Miracle of Meridian," he told her. "Not the most original name, but it seems to have caught on with the public. How are you holding up, Admiral?" "Tired," Voss admitted, "but glad it worked. Glad we're all still here to talk about it." "You should be proud of what you accomplished today," Reyes said. "I know it wasn't an easy decision, using that protocol, but you made the right call." Voss appreciated the words, though she still felt the weight of everything that had happened, pressing on her more heavily than she let on. She thought about the human crews who had not survived the battle, despite the overall victory, and about the uncertain road still ahead. But for now, at least, Meridian was safe, and the Empire had proof that the Skarn could be defeated. That would have to be enough, for tonight. In the weeks following the Battle of Meridian, The Sol Empire began to change in ways that surprised even its own leaders. News of the victory spread quickly across every human world, carried by official reports, and, faster still, by rumors and half-true stories passed between frightened civilians who desperately wanted something to hope for. The tale of the Ragnarok, once a secret buried so deep that most people had believed it was only a myth, was suddenly on the lips of nearly every person in human space. Some called it a miracle, others called it humanity's guardian angel, finally waking after 200 years of sleep. Admiral Voss found the attention uncomfortable, but she understood why people needed it. After weeks of nothing but bad news, humanity finally had a victory to hold on to. But Voss knew, better than almost anyone, that one battle did not win a war. The Skarn had lost a fleet and a flagship at Meridian, but intelligence reports gathered in the days that followed made it clear that the invasion was far from over. Scout ships reported at least 2 more major Skarn fleets still operating within striking distance of human territory, along with smaller raiding forces continuing to harass outlying colonies that had not yet felt the full weight of the invasion. The Skarn, it seemed, were not the kind of enemy that gave up after a single defeat. The Joint Command Council convened once again, this time with a very different atmosphere than the panicked, fearful meetings that had followed the fall of Kepler's rest. There was still fear in the room, but now it was mixed with something new: determination. The Ragnarok had proven that the Skarn could be beaten, and that changed everything about how the Empire's leaders approached the war ahead. "We cannot rely on the Ragnarok alone," General Reyes said during the meeting, standing before a large tactical map showing the current positions of known Skarn forces. "One ship, however powerful, cannot defend every world in the Empire at once. We need to rebuild our conventional fleets, using everything we've learned from the data the Ragnarok's engagement provided about Skarn weapons and tactics." Dr. Chen, who had remained aboard the Ragnarok as its lead technical advisor, agreed. "Arya has already begun analyzing the battle data in detail," she reported. "We've identified several weaknesses in standard Skarn shield configurations that our engineers can use to improve our own weapon systems. It won't make our ships as powerful as the Ragnarok, but it will help close the gap significantly." Admiral Voss listened to the discussion with a growing sense that, for the first time since the invasion began, the Empire finally had a real strategy, rather than just a desperate hope. The plan that emerged from the Council's deliberations was straightforward in concept, even if it would be difficult in execution. The Ragnarok would continue serving as the Empire's primary strike force, intervening in the most critical battles, where its unique power could make the greatest difference, while the rest of the human fleet rebuilt and adapted, using the knowledge gained from every engagement. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts would continue, trying to understand more about the Skarn themselves, in the hope of eventually finding a way to end the war through negotiation, rather than continued fighting, though nobody in the room held much optimism about that possibility, given the Skarn's behavior so far. Over the following months, the war continued, though its shape had changed considerably since the desperate early days of the invasion. The Ragnarok, guided by Admiral Voss and Arya's careful strategic thinking, moved from system to system, intervening in critical battles and turning the tide whenever the Skarn threatened to overwhelm human defenses completely. It was not present for every fight, and there were losses along the way. Colonies that fell before help could arrive, brave crews who did not survive their encounters with the invading fleets. War, even a war that was slowly turning in humanity's favor, still carried a heavy cost. But slowly, steadily, the balance began to shift. Human fleets, rebuilt with lessons learned from the Ragnarok's battles, grew more capable of holding their own against Skarn forces, without always needing the ancient warship's direct intervention. Colonies that had once seemed helpless began organizing more effective local defenses, and the Skarn, for their part, began showing signs of hesitation that had not been present in the earliest days of the invasion, their fleets more cautious, their attacks less relentlessly aggressive than before. During those months of rebuilding, Voss found herself spending time not only on military strategy, but on something she had not expected to become part of her responsibilities: public reassurance. Word of the Ragnarok's role in the Battle of Meridian had spread far beyond what the Joint Command Council had originally intended, and citizens across the Empire began asking difficult questions about the ancient warship, its history, and the mysterious weapon it had used to destroy the Skarn flagship. Some praised the Ragnarok as a hero. Others expressed fear, worried that a weapon powerful enough to destroy a Skarn flagship in a single strike might one day pose a danger to humanity itself, especially given the vague rumors that began circulating about its troubled history during the HFY War. The Joint Command Council debated how much information to release to the public. Some members argued for complete transparency, believing that hiding the truth about the ship's dangerous history would only breed greater distrust if the full story eventually came out on its own. Others worried that revealing the details of the HFY protocol's past failure might cause panic, or worse, might convince desperate colonists on the frontier that the Empire was willing to risk uncontrolled devastation in the name of victory. In the end, Voss herself was asked to address the Senate directly, delivering a carefully prepared account of the Ragnarok's history, its capabilities, and the reasoning behind the decision to reactivate it. She stood before the assembled senators, many of whom eyed her with a mixture of gratitude and wariness, and spoke plainly about both the ship's power and its risks. "I will not pretend the Ragnarok is without danger," she told them. "It carries a weapon capable of terrible destruction, one that failed catastrophically the first time it was ever used in true combat, 2 centuries ago. But I have seen, with my own eyes, what the alternative looks like. I have walked among refugees who lost everything in a single afternoon. I have read reports of entire colonies erased in hours. The Ragnarok is dangerous, yes, but right now, it is also the only thing standing between the Sol Empire and an enemy that has shown no interest in mercy or negotiation. I intend to use it as carefully and as rarely as possible, but I will not hesitate to use it again, if that is what saving human lives requires." Her words did not silence every critic, and debates about the wisdom of relying on such a weapon continued in Senate chambers and public forums throughout the following months. But her honesty earned her a measure of trust that a more carefully managed public relations campaign might never have achieved, and slowly, as the Empire's fortunes in the war continued to improve, public anxiety about the Ragnarok began to settle into a more complicated, but generally accepting, understanding of its necessary role in the ongoing conflict. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen and her expanded engineering team continued their work, analyzing every piece of data recovered from the Ragnarok's battles, slowly unlocking secrets of its ancient technology that helped modernize and strengthen the rest of the human fleet. New shield harmonics, adapted from principles found within the Ragnarok's own systems, made human vessels significantly more resistant to Skarn weapons. Improved sensor arrays, built using techniques recovered from the ancient ship's own detection systems, gave human commanders earlier warning of incoming attacks, precious time that often made the difference between a successful defense and a devastating loss. Bit by bit, world by world, the Sol Empire grew stronger, better prepared to face an enemy that, just months earlier, had seemed unstoppable. It was nearly 8 months after the Battle of Meridian when the war reached what would later be remembered as its true turning point. Intelligence gathered from a captured Skarn scout ship revealed the location of what appeared to be a major Skarn command center, a heavily defended system deep within territory the aliens had claimed during the early days of the invasion. If the reports were accurate, striking this command center could disrupt the entire Skarn invasion effort, potentially forcing them to abandon their campaign against humanity altogether. The Joint Command Council debated the risk extensively. Attacking a heavily defended enemy command center was a dangerous gamble, one that could result in devastating losses if the intelligence proved wrong, or if the Skarn defenses were stronger than anticipated. But the potential reward, an actual end to the war that had already cost so many lives, was too significant to ignore. "I want to lead this myself," Voss told the council when the final decision was being made. "The Ragnarok will spearhead the assault, with the newly rebuilt 3rd and 5th fleets providing support. If we can strike hard and fast, we have a real chance of ending this war before it costs any more lives than it already has." The council approved the plan, and 3 weeks later, the combined human assault force jumped into the system identified by the captured intelligence, ready for what everyone involved understood might be the final major battle of the war. The Skarn command center, when they arrived, proved to be exactly as heavily defended as feared, protected by dozens of orbital defense platforms and a substantial fleet stationed to guard it. The battle that followed was fierce and costly, unfolding over nearly 6 hours of continuous fighting. The Ragnarok, once again pushed to its limits, tore through Skarn defenses alongside the human support fleets, while Arya coordinated a complex series of maneuvers designed to isolate and overwhelm the command center's defenses, one section at a time. At the height of the battle, facing a concentration of Skarn firepower more intense than anything encountered even at Meridian, Voss once again found herself weighing the terrible choice of whether to authorize the use of the Ashfall protocol. This time, she hesitated longer than before, remembering Arya's warning about the unpredictable risks the weapon still carried. But watching the losses mounting among the human support fleets, watching brave crews fighting and dying to hold the line, she made the same choice she had made at Meridian, trusting in Arya's careful precision to keep the devastating power contained. The Ashfall protocol fired once more, and the heart of the Skarn command center's defenses was shattered in a single, overwhelming strike. Without the coordination and protection the command center had provided, the remaining Skarn forces in the system began to fall into disarray, and within another hour, the battle was effectively over. The Sol Empire had struck a decisive blow against the very core of the Skarn invasion effort. In the days that followed, reports began arriving from across human space, describing a sudden and dramatic shift in Skarn behavior. Fleets that had been advancing steadily into human territory began pulling back. Colonies that had been under active siege reported a sudden halt in Skarn attacks. It seemed that, whatever the destroyed command center's true role had been in coordinating the invasion, its loss had thrown the entire Skarn campaign into chaos, forcing a retreat that nobody in the Sol Empire had truly dared to hope for just months earlier. It would take several more months of careful, cautious fighting before the Sol Empire could confirm that the invasion had truly ended, with the last significant Skarn forces withdrawing from human territory entirely, retreating back toward whatever unknown region of space they had come from. There was no formal surrender, no treaty signed between two governments meeting as equals. The Skarn simply left, as suddenly and mysteriously as they had first arrived, leaving behind a devastated, but surviving, Sol Empire to begin the long process of rebuilding. Admiral Elena Voss stood once again in the control core of the Ragnarok, months after that final battle, looking out at the stars through the ship's main view screen. The war was over, at least for now, though nobody could say with certainty whether the Skarn might return someday, or whether some other threat might emerge from the vast unknown reaches of space beyond the Sol Empire's borders. But for the first time in nearly a year, she allowed herself to simply feel relief, rather than the constant tension that had driven her through every difficult decision of the war. "Arya," she said quietly, "do you think we'll need the Ashfall protocol again someday?" "I cannot say for certain, Admiral," Arya replied. "But I believe that is precisely why this ship was built in the first place, 2 centuries ago. Not because our creators wanted to use such power, but because they understood that sometimes, having the option available is the only thing standing between survival and destruction. I hope, as I believe you do, that we will not need it again for a very long time. But if the day comes when the Sol Empire faces another threat it cannot face alone, the Ragnarok will be ready." Voss nodded slowly, thinking about the long history of the ship she now commanded, built in desperation 200 years ago, buried in fear for generations, and finally woken again, when humanity's need became too great to ignore. She thought about all the people who had survived because of the choices made in those difficult months, and all the people who had not, whose sacrifices would not be forgotten. The Sol Empire would rebuild. New colonies would rise where old ones had fallen. New fleets would be built, stronger and wiser for everything the war had taught them. And somewhere out among the stars, the Ragnarok would remain, no longer hidden in secret, but standing openly, as a reminder of both the terrible cost of war and the strength that could be found when humanity refused to give up, even in its darkest hour. As the ship continued its slow patrol along the Empire's newly secured borders, Admiral Voss allowed herself, for just a moment, to simply watch the stars in peaceful silence, grateful for a future that, until recently, had seemed impossibly uncertain, and ready, whatever challenges might come next, to face them with the same warship that had once again proven itself humanity's final and greatest hope. A year after the last Skarn ships withdrew from human territory, a formal ceremony was held on Meridian to honor everyone who had fought and died during the invasion. Voss stood before a massive crowd gathered in the capital's largest public square, surrounded by the families of the fallen, the survivors of destroyed colonies, and the officers and crews who had fought alongside her throughout the long, difficult war. She thought again of the woman she had met in the refugee district, so long ago now, who had asked whether her husband's death at the Corvid cluster had meant something. Voss looked out at the crowd, at the rebuilt buildings, and the children playing in the square who had been born into a war, and were now growing up in something that finally resembled peace, and she believed, with as much certainty as she had ever felt about anything, that it had. The Ragnarok itself was no longer hidden away in secrecy. Instead, by decision of the Joint Command Council, it was given a new, permanent posting at a purpose-built station near the Empire's border, visible and known to every citizen of the Sol Empire, a symbol both of the terrible cost of war and of humanity's ability to endure even the darkest of threats. Dr. Chen remained aboard as its lead technical officer, continuing to study its ancient systems and slowly training a new generation of engineers who might one day understand the ship as deeply as its original creators once had. Arya, for its part, took on a new role as well, serving not only as the Ragnarok's tactical intelligence, but as an advisor to the Empire's rebuilding fleet programs, sharing what insight it could offer from its unique perspective spanning two different wars, fought 2 centuries apart. Voss herself was offered a promotion to the highest ranks of Empire Command, a position that would have taken her away from active fleet duty and into a life of strategic oversight from the safety of Meridian. She considered the offer carefully, understanding the honor it represented, but in the end, she chose to remain aboard the Ragnarok, at least for a while longer. She had grown to feel a strange, deep connection to the ancient ship and the strange, thoughtful intelligence that guided it, and she did not feel ready to leave that duty behind just yet, not while so much uncertainty still remained about what other threats might lie waiting somewhere out in the vast darkness beyond the Empire's borders. Late one evening, months after the formal peace ceremony, Voss sat alone in the Ragnarok's control core, reviewing routine patrol reports by the soft blue light of the ancient consoles. Arya's voice broke the comfortable silence. "Admiral, may I ask you something?" "Of course," Voss said, setting aside her data pad. "Do you regret any of the choices you made during the war, particularly regarding the Ashfall Protocol?" Voss considered the question seriously, as she always did with Arya's inquiries. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret every life lost, on both sides, and I regret that our ancestors ever had to build a weapon this dangerous in the first place. But do I regret the choice to use it, when I did? No. I believe it saved more lives than it risked, both times." "That doesn't make it easy. I don't think it's supposed to be easy." "I find that a reasonable answer, Admiral," Arya said. "For what it is worth, I believe Fleet Admiral Kestrel would have approved of your judgment, had she lived to see it." Voss allowed herself a small, tired smile at that, thinking once more of the woman who had stood in this same chamber 2 centuries before her, facing choices no less difficult than her own. "I hope so," she said quietly. Outside the view screen, the stars continued their slow, silent turning, indifferent to the wars fought and won beneath them, and somewhere among them, humanity continued forward, wiser and more careful than before, but unbroken, ready to face whatever the future still had waiting.